here today to begin a conversation about one of the most prevalent challenges facing graduate student success. So maybe we've all heard of imposter syndrome. Today, we're going to explore the phenomenon, who it affects, and share some ways to unpack and challenge our own imposterism. The syndrome is the impact on the individual. And phenomenon is how we describe the experience among a group of individuals. When I speak to graduate students, I choose to describe this as a phenomenon because it is so prevalent. It is bigger than any one student's experience. So I want to be that content. It's not any one person. It's really kind of common for many grad students. I'm going to paraphrase what Cox and other experts have to say about imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is defined as a self-perceived phoniness amongst high-performing individuals. It's that feeling, some students, I've heard them say, oh, I got admitted, but I thought I would get found out, that I don't belong here. Or I was in the seminar room and I thought, if I open my mouth, they're all gonna know I'm a fraud. It's that kind of experience of feeling like you don't belong because you're not as good as the other students in the room or in the lab, or whatever the context is, the people in the conference, everyone else is smarter than me, however you want to describe that. And what Cox identifies is it's based on the idea of pluralistic ignorance, or the premise that we all privately think we're less worthy than others, but we think we're alone in having those worries. So it's compounded because you feel like I'm the only one that's not good enough to be here. And historically, syndrome has been well documented among some folks who most definitely are not academic imposters, including Maya Angelou, who received numerous awards, including a Pulitzer, a Tony, Grammys, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, as well as being a modern-day literary giant and civil rights activist, and Albert Einstein, who described himself as an involuntary swindler whose work didn't deserve as much attention as it received. So it's really kind of humbling to think that they didn't think they were worthy of their notoriety or praise for their work. So that gives you a sense of how prevalent this phenomenon really is. Within higher education, imposter syndrome is one of the primary challenges to all new graduate student success. It is also prevalent in underrepresented or minoritized communities. So among women, ethnic minority students, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, international students, our LGBTQ community, and other populations where cultural invisibility or dissonance, that sense that nobody here understands me or is like me, or underrepresentation, where we look around and we don't see a lot of other people who look like us, are already crucial challenges. And statistically, they say it affects upwards of 70% of graduate students at some point in their graduate academic career. So that's why we say phenomenon rather than syndrome. So why is it so pervasive? Well, we already briefly covered two very specific reasons it tends to affect some communities harder than others: cultural dissonance and underrepresentation. But more broadly, we can distill the problem down to three interrelated factors. One, we don't talk about imposter syndrome or phenomenon. If we admit we're experiencing it, we are confessing that we feel inferior. And what if someone confirms that for us? Or if we are planting a seed of doubt in their minds as to our fitness to. The hallmark of imposter syndrome is pluralistic ignorance. In our minds, nobody else is doubting themselves. Talking about imposter syndrome requires vulnerability. Universities are not widely known as encouraging vulnerability, hence the reason we are here today. The second point, our academic culture and structure sets us up to experience it. By design, academia is exclusionary. and especially graduate education. It's competitive. We not only have to be the best to gain admission to graduate study, but we need to have the socio-cultural capital to understand and navigate the hidden curriculum of academia. Its little unspoken codes, implicit expectations and assumptions, as well as jargon. That means we all come in as the overachievers and all-stars of our undergrad programs or our high school or wherever we came from. And once we are here, we are suddenly not the standouts. We're surrounded by other top caliber students, and we're suddenly faced with the unfamiliar and uncomfortable sensation of being average in that cohort. And then third, we stigmatize it. One of the reasons it can be hard to talk about imposter syndrome is that there's a sense of stigma to it. Things that we could hear people say in dismissing this is it's experienced by weak-minded people, by quitters, by people who are anxious or depressed or mentally ill, or you just have low self-esteem. If you think about the fact that some people call it syndrome, are we associating it with a malady or something negative? It kind of leads us to focus on deficit instead of growth. And then that's why some people refer to it as imposterism rather than imposter syndrome. Okay, so now we know what it is. How do we challenge ourselves to overcome it? There are some practices that we're going to share today that we feel like are probably the best, at least starting places, or friends of yours if you have friends that are experiencing this. So you can share these tips with them as well. But we suggest that you also adapt and add your own practices as you learn what works for you. So the first tip is something that can seem a bit counterintuitive. This is to accept the imposterism. Know that it will crop up. Take time to sit with and understand what your personal imposterism trigger might be, and embrace that you might feel fraudulent at times. Know that imposterism strikes high-performing, driven, focused individuals. That's you. That's practically every grad student. And if Albert Einstein and Maya Angelou couldn't escape it, how on earth do you suppose that you would? Our personal backgrounds and histories shape the way we experience imposterism, and every one of these ways is valid. Your imposterism will be set off by different triggers than mine or Dr. McGilvery's. It's for each of us as our own. Consider, if we feel like outsiders, we feel like others don't share our perspectives, cultures, or values, or feel like we don't fit in, we're carrying additional invisible baggage that compounds standard run-of-the-mill imposterism, the burden of representation, stereotype threat, or the expectations that we create for ourselves. Once we've accepted the likely inevitability of imposterism, we've identified and sat with our triggers and understand logically why we feel fraudulent, we come to the hardest part of this tip. We have to not only accept our imposterism, but give ourselves grace and self-compassion to experience it. All right. Next, we need to know how to de-escalate our imposterism. A great way to do that is to separate our feelings from fact. When we are in the midst of imposterism, it feels all-consuming and overwhelming. This step can send us spiraling. So there's a workplace analogy that we can use. And this is a scenario that many people are probably familiar with. If they haven't done it themselves, they've seen other people do it. You accidentally hit reply all on an email that you meant to respond directly to the sender. So if you've done this, you know what that feels like. And if you've seen somebody else do it, sometimes you're like, oh, ow. You feel it vicariously. So it can be crippling. So this one can send you sulking, can make you wonder if you're qualified to do your job. But your performance does not boil down to one incident. But in the moment, you can feel like, especially if you're already having a bad day or already stressed, you might feel like you're a failure. And that's why it's important to step back from that initial response and analyze the situation. Why do I feel like I'm a fraud in this moment? Then if you can rattle off a couple of answers on your, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's fine because you've named, defined, and in so doing, you've contained your self-perceived incompetence. Okay, the next tip is to flip your script. So remember, imposter syndrome affects high-performing individuals. That's why it's so prevalent amongst graduate students, because graduate school takes the best, brightest, and most promising in their area and further hones them. So if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, you might actually be awesome. If there's a theme to the tips I'm sharing today, it's that intentionality and mindfulness, the practice of remaining mentally in the present moment and paying attention to what we are experiencing right now can be incredibly useful tools in our arsenal against imposterism. When we practice reframing our perspectives and mental practices, over time, those practices become reflexive. So shifting our mind brings quantifiable changes in not only our brain chemistry, but brain structure itself over time. This is something called neuroplasticity. So with that in mind, we offer these tips. 1, pursue a growth mindset. When you catch yourself beating yourself up over a perceived failure, take a different perspective and recognize it as a learning experience. Create an alternative narrative. Instead of beating yourself up over that mistake, remind yourself you're new at this. You don't know, but you're learning. Instead of feeling inadequate, think, wow, there are so many smart people here. I will learn so much from these other people. And finally, get in the habit of distinguishing your needs from your wants. So this is an exercise in building intentionality into our thought processes and shifting toward growth mindset, and a way to start examining your own thought processes. So one example might be, instead of dragging yourself around and you're like, oh, I really need some coffee. You could train yourself to rethink, no, I would like coffee, right? You don't need it. It's, you want it. So needing coffee is ambiguous, all-consuming, and a bit defeatist. And if we ask ourselves why we need it, we tend not to answer in specifics. It's, I just got to have it, right? So instead, if you think, okay, really, I would like coffee, that invites a little bit deeper. So we can ask ourselves, why do I want it? And you can start to think in terms of specifics, like I enjoy the taste or the smell of the coffee, or I enjoy holding the mug, the warm mug in my hand. And you're getting into the more specifics of that particular experience. So these are ways to sort of engage in a more mindful or intentional thought process. So we talked briefly about an alternative narrative and reframing our own expectations. So now let's elaborate briefly on that idea of reframing, and talk about the concept of beginner's mind. By this, we mean the openness, eagerness to learn, and sense of wonder that characterizes a novice mindset. There is a Zen maxim. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. Sometimes what we think we know gets in the way of what we need to learn. It means you have to leave some of the ego, but I was top of my class, I should be doing better. And judgment, what can I possibly learn from this guy? He didn't go to the same school I went to, whatever that is, that judgment. You got to leave that at the door. So more importantly, for our purposes, a novice mindset is one that recognizes where growth is possible without self-judgment or, that inner critic that you have. This is something you don't need to know. You don't need to worry about this. And that lacks preconceived notions of what we know, what we should know, and how we should learn. So we talked a little bit about the weird culture of academia with its own cultural signifiers and jargon. As an incoming grad student, no matter your background, at times you're not going to have the cultural currency of academia to understand everything being thrown at you. Belong here, and that somehow you missed a memo every one of your peers received. So think back to when you were an undergrad. Everyone was kind of in the same boat, right? Neither you nor your peers knew what to expect and had no qualms about asking where the library or the rec center was. In higher ed, we'd kind of treat incoming students, undergrads, with kid gloves, and we roll out the welcome wagon and go the extra mile and make sure our students acclimate to the new environment. At the graduate level, that's not always going to be the case. Faculty may have expectations that you hit the ground running, and they may not explain all of the processes to you. And you might feel pressure to prove that you're up to the challenge and that you already know what you're doing. And that might leave you feeling occasionally overwhelmed. So let's unpack that. That means we don't have a currency problem in terms of knowledge. We have a fluency issue in terms of understanding the networks. So that's why community building with our peers, with our family, and establishing relationships where we feel safe to talk about our backgrounds and perceived deficits are so important. Okay, so we talked about this before. It bears repeating though. The power imposterism holds over us is based in the isolation in which we experience it, that idea of pluralistic ignorance. So maybe the most effective way to combat imposterism is simply to talk about it. So that's why that community building or connection with the faculty and establishing relationships where we feel safe to talk about our fears and concerns are very important. So you want to try to find those supportive communities where you can find people who have some sense of commonality with you in terms of purpose, identity, values, and make sure to celebrate successes and strengths. And, look for the people that you can feel safe with in terms of receiving criticism. They can provide reassurance, but also non-judgmental constructive feedback to help you check the validity of the fears that you're encountering.